I'm Hanish Patel, and this is User Friendly, the show where we explore emerging trends in tech, media, and telecom, and how they impact business, operations, and the world around you. Hey User Friendly listeners, this is your host, Hanish Patel. We'll be back with our regular scheduled program in early 2023. But while we work on a few new episodes for you, we wanted to share our recommended listening list and to recap a few of our top episodes from the past few seasons. Our user-friendly series recently hit a major milestone of 1 million downloads, and we couldn't have accomplished that without our listeners like you. In reflecting on that milestone, it seems like a good time to look back at some of the most downloaded and commented on episodes. I'm excited to kick off the list with one of my all-time favourite episodes, Advancing Women in Sports. As a sports fanatic myself, I'm thrilled to hear more about the convergence of entertainment and sports, specifically as it relates to the better representation of female athletes and how brands can play a role in supporting women in sports. Check out a little snippet from our episode with Shiz Suzuki and Kathy Engelbert.
If you think about even a definition of a brand, that is this emotional meeting ground between a company and its people. And when I say people, that's customers, it's prospects, it's employees. And there's so much research out there that shows that when people love a brand, when customers love a brand, they are willing to spend more money, pay higher prices, recommend that company to their friends and family, and forgive them when unfortunately things go wrong. And I think all of us are very much so aware that the customers of today, and if we think about the customers of tomorrow, they're very, very much so particular about how and where they spend their money. And I think it rings true that people want to see themselves reflected in things like the content that they watch or the things that they buy, and certainly the kinds of businesses they do business with. And if you think about 50% of the US population being women, 85% of household purchase decisions being made by women, for a company like AT&T, it makes complete business sense to ensure that our brand is associated with strong female-centric brands like the WNBA. But the reality is the stats are staggering. From a women in sports perspective, less than 4% of media coverage is women's sports, and less than 1% of sponsorships dollars goes to women's sports. We obviously, as a holistic industry, we need to do better than that. But there has been this really exciting momentum happening, and we're starting to see some changes.
Shiz, thank you for that. Those stats just astounded me. And I remember, Kathy, in a recent op-ed you did, I kind of read those stats and I really had to take a double take, frankly, to think that the percentage is so low in comparison, especially Shiz, when you talk about we want to see a reflection of ourselves out there. And like you said, it's 50%, but it's far from the balance when you think about media coverage and the percentage of sponsorship dollars going out that way. So Kathy, to that point, I'd like to move to you. And when I think about Deloitte, the WNBA and AT&T, seem like quite an odd pairing for this podcast with the three of us on there. But there's a real good reason for why we're all here. And the inaugural group of the WNBA Changemakers business sponsors include Deloitte and AT&T. So to that, Kathy, can you explain for our listeners what this platform is and what spurred its creation?
Yeah, sure, Hanish. First, it's great to be here. Second, without Shiz and AT&T last season in a bubble, by the way, in the middle of a pandemic and a racial justice crisis, we don't have a season. So back to your question, Hanish, as to what a WNBA Changemaker is all about. When we negotiated a very historic and progressive collective bargaining agreement, because our players in the WNBA are unionized, so we negotiated that last year, we launched the WNBA Changemakers platform. And it was literally to directly support the WNBA and women's sports, because I'm a big believer that we're hopefully also lifting women's sports across the spectrum. And, I love Shiz's emotional meeting ground because this was more than just a partnership. This is about activating it to help our transformation across being a very player-first league, marketing, branding, fan experience. So in light of recent conversations that Shiz just mentioned around disparities between men's and women's sports and the opinion piece I did on the conversation needs to shift to companies no longer checking off a box in their internal diversity, equity, and inclusion, but putting weight behind something impactful, something they have an emotional connection to because they're building a brand or they're looking for a consumer base that basically matches the values, ideals, and the fan base that we have. And so I think by founding and launching the WNBA Changemakers, this is a platform by which we want companies and more companies to come in and take advantage of the momentum that we see in women's sports.
This episode with guests Janet Fouty and Steve Hasker on digital transformation asked a familiar question that we still hear today. How can organizations continue to operate and serve customers well amid challenges such as the pandemic? Here, Janet and Steve share their thoughts on how putting people first is at the core of every great business.
It's really become in my view, that this shift from survive to thrive depends on an organization becoming and really remaining distinctly human at its core. This idea of being distinctly human, I think, is so powerful, and maybe a couple of examples of how we've been thinking about this. So how do we integrate our workers' physical, mental, and social health into the design of work rather than addressing well-being with adjacent programs? Embedding well-being into work. And I've been trying to move away from the discussion of work-life balance for a long time, but embedding well-being into work design really helps your people experience well-being while they do their work, not just when they're away from it. And so good for thinking about how you really address the human need for quality of life, which can motivate people in a really different way. The second thing I've been thinking about here is how do you capitalize on worker agency, both in terms of something we've been talking a lot about recently, which is where people work, but also choice in terms of how you drive learning, adaptability, and impact, giving workers more control over what they do and what learning experiences they can pursue to really increase their engagement in a much more meaningful way. So when I think about the last year and the decisions that leaders had to make in terms of digital collaboration platforms, enabling worker choice, changing schedules, changing meeting norms, just even think about this conversation today, are all about how do we embed well-being and agency into the way the work gets done. And Steve said it so well, it is so distinctly human. And I think bottling what we've learned over the last 18 months to that end and figuring out how to drive that into our strategies and approaches going forward sort of sits at the heart of the answer to your question.
So I'd love to drill in on that, right? Both of you have really put forward about being distinctly human, but yet we go back to the definition of digital transformation and looking at how some of the more human manual activities can now be taken over by potentially digital aspects, digital processes, other areas. How do we balance that? And how do you, as leaders of organizations, balance that?
I think part of it, I'll start, Janet, with a comment or two. I think part of it is a segmentation of different sort of tasks and responsibilities. In an ideal environment, the sort of digitization of an automation of many tasks actually is additive in value to our colleagues because it frees them up to do the fun stuff. To Janet's point about moving from work-life balance to sort of wellness at work, nobody wants to take hours and hours performing, sort of grinding through boring tasks. And the extent to which a digital transformation frees up knowledge workers to focus on value-added tasks. And, one example for us at Thomson Reuters is our salespeople relying on digital technologies for CRM and dynamic intelligence around their customers and their upcoming calls, and automatic billing and renewal and resolution of customer issues. The best salespeople just want that. They want all of their time, their waking hours, or their working hours to be focused on selling and making customers happy, not troubleshooting and problem solving and doing administrative tasks. So in a perfect environment, what digitization does is significantly additive to the employee experience because it means that the job is more interesting, is more diverse, is more dynamic and intellectually engaging. Now, in the real world, obviously, there are some places where that means that jobs and roles are displaced and moved to lower cost locations or replaced by machines, and I get that. But I do think that positive aspect of it is often overlooked.
So I would just underscore Steve's point with a frame that I've been thinking about, which is this intersection of people and machines, AI in particular.
Mm-hmm.
We've sort of come up with this phrase or frame called super teams, which is you think about how do the machines or how does AI actually complement your team, and thinking about it as a member of your team, not, it's a little bit to Steve's earlier point about digital is not its own thing, but this idea that AI is embedded in the work that your team is doing through this frame of super teams has been a really interesting frame of reference to help us think about not replacing people with machines or AI, but complementing them and performing the less interesting, more mundane, and more predictable tasks to free up our teams and our people to do much more interesting and important things.
As we consider the intersection of people and machines, I can't help but think about a device that connects them both, the smartphone. This next clip includes perspectives from Jan Arbanas and Harry Moseley on how it all comes back to connectivity. Take a listen. Going along that thread of thinking, and both of you have mentioned the different types of services that you can do through connectivity, and we're seeing that, and certainly a lot of devices that are going to need to be connected. Again, be that for an example you just cited there or for entertainment. And you mentioned smartphone as well. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that, both you, Jana and Harry, is how do you see all of that impacting what many would see as the absolute go-to device for anything they do, which is the smartphone?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Again, I'll go back to our survey and just sort of root the conversation in some data. So the average US household now has 25 connected devices. In my house, we have more than that for sure. When I think about laptops, tablets, smartphones, headphones, fitness devices, as I mentioned before, but not to mention that I run my home on my smartphone and some of the connected devices in that way. So the smartphone, to your point, is absolutely at the center of that relative to the apps that control many things in your home and in your life, the apps that you use for entertainment, and then apps, frankly, that you use to order food, purchase things online. The smartphone is at the center, but what we are seeing is more connected devices. And frankly, what was interesting in the survey is that households went from 11 types of devices in 2019 to 14 types of devices. So there is absolutely a differentiation, and people are using specific devices for different things, right? Depending upon what they're trying to achieve. So I do think that element is interesting. And I think it actually comes back to connectivity, right? So if you think about connectivity in your home, that's going to support all of the connected devices and enable you, Hanish, to be able to get on video, even though your kids, right, are streaming shows and playing video games. But then also your connectivity from your smartphone perspective, that's going to enable you to do stuff not only in your home, but when you're out and about. And so connectivity, I think, actually becomes a bigger part of the conversation to support all these technologies that we've all adopted and that we're finding convenience from and efficiency from. We're starting, I think, to feel the strain of that on our current sort of technology and the connectivity that we have today. And that's why I think the 5G conversation becomes really interesting relative to connectivity in your home and connectivity for your device. I don't know, Harry, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're 200% right. It's all about connectivity. I can have great apps and, if I haven't got a great connection, doesn't really make a difference. It's like nothing's going to work. The freedom that we get as a consequence of the smartphone, the mobile devices, quite fascinating. Being able to control the home from, several hundred miles away, thousands of miles away, wherever you are on the planet, be able to turn the heat up, turn the heat down, monitor situations. It's quite fascinating. One of the things that we've seen over the last 18 months is digital adoption at scale. Whether you're in financial services, whether you're in healthcare, whether you're in education, whether you're in government, it doesn't really matter what industry you're in. Everybody now understands something that, our CEO and founder, Eric Yuan, built Zoom around, which is that video is the new voice. People now get it.
And our last episode clip touches on an industry that is always evolving, venture capital. Guests Arif Jan Mohammed and Heather Gates dive into some of the challenges VCs and startups face and some of the similarities we might see in enterprise companies. More from their conversation here. I'd love to know more about maybe some of the challenges they're facing in the current landscape and how does that compare to, say, enterprise companies faring in the current pandemic world that we're living in?
Well, you're right, Hanish. It's not all up and to the right. And one of the stark truths about the venture capital industry is not every company will make it. In fact, there's a quite high mortality in venture capital among startups because it is extremely hard to start a company from scratch and to build it into a sustainable long-term company. Again, those companies that make it, they reap the rewards and they can be very, very highly valued if they're in the right market, if they're growing at a very high pace. But unfortunately, not every company does make it. And so one of the byproducts of a lot of venture capital chasing, a relatively small amount of companies being funded is you can have a lot of competition in markets. You can have a lot of companies, startups competing for the same end dollar, whether it's on the consumer side and that consumer's ability to transact, or you could have enterprise companies competing for the same end customers. And so, that can potentially depress prices. It can potentially create confusion among customers. It can also create a lot of competition for VC dollars, but also for talent, because ultimately there's a limitation of talent on a global basis. So there are challenges, but at the same time, I remain extremely optimistic because as we digitize more and more, as we go through on the enterprise side, what we call the digital transformation of the enterprise, there's an incredible amount of opportunity ahead of us to really change the way that we all work, the way that we transact, and the way we communicate together.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And the first thing that comes to my mind is the war for talent. We see it across our businesses and our companies, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about the future of work and what that looks like. And I think we're kind of on the precipice of figuring out what does work look like going forward. And what's fascinating as I look at a lot of the startups that we've worked with over the years, many of them have been virtual for quite some time. So I think, when the pandemic came across, and impacted a lot of companies that were always in person with meetings and on airplanes, et cetera, they were very well equipped to immediately go to a virtual world because they were already there. So I think that's a great advantage. I do think that providing that flexibility is also going to be a competitive advantage for talent, but there is just limited supply. We spend a lot of time with the finance function. I can't tell you how many companies are looking for qualified finance people because going from a private enterprise to a public company requires a level of knowledge and understanding and savvy that is limited in supply.
Yeah, Hanish, you touched on the question of how enterprise funding or enterprise startups have fared in this new world. And the new world is specifically that of post-COVID. And I'll say last March of 2020 was a very difficult year because there was so much uncertainty about what the coming year would hold. We, as the venture capital industry, really didn't have a strong perspective. And I'd say those enterprise companies that were on the right side of history, and I'll touch on that in a second, but those companies that were on the right side of history have fared extremely well. And what do I mean by the right side of history? It's those companies that are cloud first, those companies that are digital first, those companies that really facilitate things like Heather talked about, which is remote collaboration, remote work, global workforces, but more specifically that facilitate digital transformation. Last April, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said on an earnings call, 3 years of digital transformation in the enterprise have happened in less than a month. I mean, it was just dramatic how the IT industry had to completely pivot and transform itself in order to remain competitive and to compete in what suddenly became a global first, remote first world. And the beneficiaries of that were startups that really facilitated the digital transformation. And so enterprise companies that were cloud first, that really rode the world of transformation to cloud and SaaS, those companies over the last year have just seen increased growth. they've seen increased spend and increased pull from customers. And you see that in the public markets, but also in the private markets, where we've got a large number of portfolio companies that are just both SaaS or security first, taking advantage of this shift to the cloud.
Well, there you have it. Whether we're discussing sports, digital transformation, connectivity, or startups, we hope to be your source for emerging trends and topics in tech, media, telecom, and sports. I've certainly enjoyed revisiting a few of our episodes and hope you all did as well. To listen in full to all the episodes, visit userfriendly.deloitte. As always, we appreciate your support and feedback. Please reach out with any suggestions for future topics, and don't forget to rate us or share a review on your favourite podcatcher. And until next time, happy listening. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast belong to them and do not necessarily reflect those of Deloitte. This podcast should not be deemed or construed to be for the purposes of soliciting business for any of the companies mentioned, nor does Deloitte advocate or endorse the services or products provided by these companies.